Hello. This presentation is called Discomfort in Conversations Between Novice Language Learners. My name is Maddie Winnicky, and this presentation was from my thesis that I completed through my Master's in Education and World Language Instruction from Concordia College in Moorhead, Minnesota. I also went to the College of St. Benedict in St. Joseph, and I currently am a Spanish teacher at Hastings High School in Hastings, Minnesota. So in this presentation, I'm going to go over my thesis. I'm going to talk about the literature around interpersonal communication. I'll go over my research and my findings and implications specific to novice language learners. I want to start off with this sort of mantra that has inspired my master's in education thesis and this presentation and kind of everything that I do in my classroom, to be honest. I share this with students each fall, with families at conferences, and it's just something that drives me personally. A comfort zone is a beautiful place, but nothing ever grows there. And I think in a language classroom that this is one of my top priorities is getting students out of their comfort zone, and that's different for every student what that looks like. And then particularly, I find that students are most commonly out of their comfort zone when they're speaking in Spanish with other people. So, for the topic of my thesis, I decided to explore discomfort in conversations between novice language learners. I specifically picked this because I teach in a traditional foreign language student and I teach a lot of Spanish 1 students. That means that a lot of students that I have are ninth graders and they're learning and being exposed to Spanish for the first time. So, it's a lot of novice language learners and very novice, even though they're already in high school. I also found that there's a need in my traditional context to implement more best practices that are based on theory and research that I found in my master's in education program. And I found that to be a challenge with some of the traditional aspects of working with novice students in a high school setting, especially when we're working on growth and proficiency. So I wanted to see what this looks like in the real world and study it. So I decided to focus on two key variables to explore and assess in the study, which were interpersonal communication performance, something that I could more quantitatively assess, and affective factors. So I developed with those variables and this topic an explanatory mixed method study of comfort levels in high school novice language learners in a Spanish classroom. So my two research questions were, what is the impact of conversations on comfort level in the novice learner's Spanish classroom? And what affective factors influence interpersonal speaking performance? So, in a nutshell, which is really challenging, there's a lot of research and theory around interpersonal communication, and a lot of it ties into theory of language teaching in general, language acquisition. So I first explored in researching that interpersonal communication doesn't exist in isolation. There's been a lot of sort of debate and shifting between cognitive and affective factors in language education throughout the last number of decades. So I started to look into sociocultural theory, and I found that two elements of Vygotsky sociocultural theory that were foundational to changing perspectives in language education were the zone of proximal development and perseverance. And so the zone of proximal development is the social and linguistic space that is the best fit for language acquisition to occur. And it's like constantly finding that balance. And in education settings, this cognitive and cultural space is designed and facilitated by the teacher through a lot of planning and scaffolding and support. And then perseverance is the Russian term that Vygotsky used to describe the unification of environmental factors and individual factors in learning experiences. So, specifically in regards to emotions. So, it speaks a lot to the cognitive and affective balance on language education. I also looked into how communicative language teaching has evolved and how that obviously leads to interpersonal communication. So, kind of communicative language teaching as a whole is an approach to language education that is largely centered around communicative competence and learners completing communicative tasks or task based communicative activities. This supports both the social and cognitive aspects of language learning. And specifically, Chomsky came up largely with the idea of communicative competence. And that was a foundational movement in this communicative language teaching approach. Chomsky differentiated competence from language performance as a way of theorizing how language is acquired through pre existing, like a cognitive network that already exists, or universal grammar, that all humans shared. And then this came up with new ideas for how language teaching and communicative competence can develop throughout learners. It was largely a cognitive model. It didn't necessarily speak to the affective factors. And then another theory based on communicative language teaching was Krashen's monitor model hypothesis and the affective filter. So the monitor model focused on comprehensible input in driving language acquisition. So Krashen said that we need to for learners, they need to be given written, visual, or oral texts that are best suited for their proficiency level. And then the affective filter hypothesis was a little bit more based on affect, and that affect can stand in the way of processing and intaking that linguistic input, even if it's comprehensible, which is based more, of course, on the affective factors. So just again, in a nutshell, that's kind of where we're led to today with interpersonal communication. And there's of course a lot more out there, but that it doesn't exist just purely cognitively. It's not as simple as here are the language structures, now use them. There's a lot else going on. And then I also wanted to just address how valuable so many people have invested so much value in interpersonal communication and language teaching specifically, and it has really been focused on as a pillar of best practices and assessment. So ACTFL has definitely in their world readiness standards, in their adoption of integrated performance assessments, and in the rubrics that go along with them, has declared that interpersonal communication is just it's essential to language growth and proficiency and performance assessment. And then I really recommend this book, High Leverage Teaching Practices. This was one of the books we read in our Concordia World Language Masters program. And it really is easy to digest in the sense that it gives teachers practices that they can implement. It gives them guides and reflection tools and ideas for how to actually implement these practices in their classrooms. And one of them is building a classroom discourse community. So in that, there are all sorts of ideas and based on research, ways to increase interpersonal communication in dyads specifically, but even just as a community of learners, and how valuable that is to language growth and in our context of language teaching in a classroom setting, how valuable it is to have a community of learners to do this with. So that is where I got sort of my ideas for this research. And then I also wanted to share with you that it's not that easy, right? There's conflicting research out there, there's conflicting philosophies with the cognitive and affective factors. And then I came across this quote by Van Battenberg in 2019 that really speaks to another layer of this challenge that I find most as an obstacle in novice language teaching. So, the prescriptive nature of form focused tasks allows learners to achieve the task goals using a small set of language structures with ease and in relative safety. Although this may support learners' willingness to communicate and self confidence for using the foreign language within the classroom context, it also creates an illusion of mastery that underprepares learners for dealing with the unpredictability of real world communication. And this to me is a little bit frightening, or it seems really dramatic because we want to support novice language learners. We want them to feel successful because we know if they don't, they will shut down, they will give up, or they will quit. And so you need to give them that zone of proximal development. You need to give them the comprehensible input and the manageable tasks for communication. But are we creating an illusion of mastery? And to what extent do we find a balance between those? So, with that, I developed this explanatory mixed method study, and I looked at these two variables that I want to quickly define because interpersonal communication can be speaking and it can be writing. It can be all sorts of different, it can look like a lot of different things. So, in this study, I defined it as formative and summative speaking tasks. So, a multiple formatives and one summative speaking task in dyads. And then affective factors, there's so many factors that influence how students feel in a classroom, but I focused on this list that I developed from the Kumaradevalu study in 2006, and they are linguistic and social discomfort, stress, willingness to communicate, and enjoyment. So here's just a little bit of my procedure, just so you understand where the results are coming from. So they did, again, 2 formative tasks and 1 summative task. So 1 and 2 are just in pairs, they're formatively speaking. And then in the summative task, they were speaking for a summative rubric assessment. And then each time they did a conversation, I had them reflect using a questionnaire to collect qualitative data on those affective factors. And so in those, I'll just share this, in those 1 and 2 and 3, so after each formative and summative speaking assessment, they were given a comfort zone scale to a Likert scale to assess themselves on. And then after the summative, they reflected on the other affective factors like stress and enjoyment. So here are the results. I looked at, again, specifically comfort level, and I was curious if it would grow over time, if it would change at all, if with the summative things would change. And honestly, I found really no consistent patterns at all. So the average Likert scale for the first formative task was 3.5. Remember, it's a scale of 1 to 5. The second Likert scale average was 3.6, so a little higher. And then the third Likert scale was a 3.2, so the lowest with the summative assessment. And I did also look to see if there was a correlation between the Likert scale for the summative assessment and the performance to see if, let's see if students who perform better had higher comfort level. And there was no significant data there were no correlations found between Likert scale and speaking performance. So I actually found that interesting because I kind of assumed or thought there would be. Also, I looked at, again, the affective factors that influence interpersonal speaking performance, and I found no significant correlations between their interpersonal speaking performance and their answers to the open-ended questionnaire. And so I'm going to break these down, but you can see I looked at linguistic discomfort, social discomfort, stress, willingness to communicate, and enjoyment. And you can see they're all like really small, like correlations, but not significant, so they're not correlated. I also looked to see if there were correlations between variables like age, race, and gender with either speaking score or the comfort, the affective factors themselves, and there was no correlation. So in this study, I found absolutely no correlations in any of the data that I looked at, which to me left me with a lot of questions. What I was excited to go through next was the qualitative data, because what I found was some really interesting answers to these questions about affective factors that definitely gave me some takeaways, and I think were most interesting for my colleagues who I shared them with, and might be for you as well. So the first question I asked them after their summative assessment was, did you feel uncomfortable because of your language level? So, linguistic discomfort. 18 participants said yes, 14 participants said no. And of the participants that said yes, they gave reasons for preparedness, proficiency, stress, and some did not list a reason. And then of the 14 participants that said no, a lot of them also did not give a reason, but a couple of them said that the reason they were not uncomfortable was because they knew what was going on. So their proficiency actually made them feel comfortable in their language level. The second question was about social interaction or social discomfort. And 15 participants here said they did feel uncomfortable because of their partner, the social interaction. And more than that said no, they did not feel uncomfortable because of their social interaction. So I found that a little interesting. What I also found interesting was the way they attributed the discomfort. So, of the participants that said yes, most of them talked about their partner because that's what the question was, but it wasn't consistent. 10 participants said that their partner was less prepared, and that's what made them feel uncomfortable. 4 participants said their partner was more prepared, and that's what made them uncomfortable because they didn't want to like negatively affect their partner's score, which doesn't actually happen. I give them a lot of coaching on the rubric, and I don't give them negative points if their partner messes up. So, anyways, and then of the 18 participants that said no, a lot of them did not list a reason, but a couple attributed that to stress. Like they didn't feel socially uncomfortable, they felt uncomfortable just because of other reasons. Or 2 people said that because their partner was nice or initiative, as they put it, that they felt comfortable working with someone else. The next question is, did you feel stressed in your conversation? Why or why not? So 26 participants said they did feel stress, and only 7 said no. Of the people who said yes to stress, a lot of them talked about stress, sort of stress in general. Like, I couldn't remember what to say. And 5 of them talked about their grade. 5 of them talked about their partner, and 2 talked about how they weren't prepared. One interesting observation I made from this data set was that some students attribute stress to internal factors like preparedness, and then some of them are externally attributed, like to their partner or their grade or their teacher or the situation in general. 7 participants said they did not feel stressed because of either their partner, their personality, saying like sort of I never feel stressed, and then 3 said it because they felt prepared or it came somewhat easy to them during the conversation. The fourth question was about willingness to communicate, and 32 out of 33 participants said they were willing to communicate. Now, this study or this summative assessment was a required summative assessment and a large part of their grade. So you can see even within the yes, 5 participants said yes because it was for a grade. It was not an optional task. And the one who said, I did not feel willing to, said that they wouldn't have done it if they didn't have to. And I didn't specifically define willing to communicate, so that we have to take that into account here. But I found it interesting that of the people that said they were willing to communicate, 7 of them attributed it to some sort of self-efficacy, like they knew what they were talking about. They were proud of their accomplishment. And then, of course, the importance of task and ease of task were other factors there. Did you enjoy this interpersonal assessment? Why or why not? Just shocked me, to be honest. 20 participants said that they did enjoy it. And I don't know if any of you teach high school students, but it's really challenging to see high school students enjoying a summative assessment. But after this reflection, I found that some of them did. So why is it even more interesting factor? Because they had the opportunity to get better. Some of them talked about they got the chance to work on their speaking, which they really appreciated. 4 people said it was really fun. And because of their partner, they enjoyed that social interaction piece. 2 participants said because it was easier than taking a test, and 4 went back to some sort of a self-efficacy in their answer, like it took me out of my comfort zone, but it was fun. I don't know if you remember the quote from the beginning of this presentation. I promise I did not prompt that student to say it took me out of my comfort zone, but that for me was the highlight of going through this data, because that student was pushed out of their comfort zone, and they grew, and they see that. They reflected on and enjoyed that process. And then 3 people said they enjoyed it even though it was stressful, because of that feeling afterwards, that feeling of sort of accomplishment and pride in their work. 7 participants said they did not enjoy the interpersonal assessment because they either weren't prepared proficiency wise, or didn't have enough time to really develop the language necessary. Their partner was a reason they did not enjoy it sometimes. And then stress. And a number of students also said neither enjoyed nor not enjoyed the interpersonal assessment. So, where does this leave us with limitations and implications? So, the study itself that I did for my master's thesis was limited to a small sample size, a size of about 35 or so. And it only took place over the month or two of the chapter that we were doing with those two formatives and one summative assessment. And this also happened, I'll add a limitation, that this happened in 2019. So before COVID is now a limitation. I think now it's hard to apply some of these takeaways to our world today. More research definitely, though, needs to be done on novice learners. That's one of the reasons I did this study, because of the research I see. It's college students, it's young language learners, and you don't get a lot of traditional high school programs that are novice language learners in these studies. So it would be interesting to try an experimental design, see what sort of affective traits might also be at play, looking at different kinds of communicative tasks, and maybe using native speakers and non-native speakers in dyads, which some research has shown is very effective. The takeaways: novice language learners do experience both stress and enjoyment. It's possible that they experience both. That was kind of new for me. Through challenging communicative tasks. Affective factors are not correlational to discomfort in conversation or interpersonal speaking performance. That's what I found in my study. Nothing was correlational. And again, that made me reflect a lot more and ask more questions. And I think this is a topic that needs to be further explored. Language teachers need to be aware then, because of the no correlation, how these affective factors exist in their individual students, because some students enjoy stress, some students do not. Some students had a good experience working with a partner, and some students did not. So teachers need to be aware of all those factors at play to both support students in finding their zone of proximal development and challenging them to grow and develop with proficiency. And then reflecting on interpersonal communication performance and these affective factors from a teacher perspective and a student perspective validates that challenges that novice language learners face. So when students were filling out, I have an example here of this 1 through 5 Likert scale. It took very little time, and students felt validated through that process. They enjoyed the process of getting to reflect. It made them ask more questions to me about their progress. They wanted more feedback. It just drew attention to the tasks that they were doing and the progress and challenges that they were facing. So that reflection piece was not part of my research, but something that definitely was an unexpected outcome. And I felt that it supported me as a teacher and students as they were growing. I added to this, since I presented my thesis last spring, another set of implications or takeaways that result in interpersonal communication in the times of COVID. These are all ideas that I've thought through this fall so far, because I still teach novice language learners. We are currently at Hastings High School in a hybrid model, and interpersonal communication is still fundamental to language development, but a lot more challenging when students are wearing masks and when students have to be 6 feet apart. And sometimes when students aren't even in the building together. So I found this year so far that students feel so much more uncomfortable when they have to wear a mask. And when we're speaking in Spanish and they can't read each other's lips and they can't read my lips, that is a huge obstacle for them. No, they're resilient and they're doing well. But I just wanted to think through and share some of my ideas that I've found so far, because my traditional signature activities where they go around the room and ask each other questions can't happen this year. And a lot of the activities where I have them speaking really close or right side by side, as you saw in the picture earlier that I did with this initial study, that can't happen this year. So things I've done in person that have been somewhat successful are inside outside circles or speed dating. Now, if it's a nice day, students in my school really appreciate the chance to go outside of the classroom or outside of the building, and they get to stand up, they get to move around. And in our school, our policy is if we're outside and 6 feet apart, that they can take off their masks. So that has been huge. If we can get outside, and there's an image here of the inside outside circle rotation that I take them through, or sometimes I just put them in lines. But that is something that I've done in the building as well with masks on. And they just need more space, but we have less students, so that still works. The hardest part, I think, is the actual hearing of their partner sometimes when they have to speak up more because of the masks. So because of that, I've probably incorporated a little more writing this year with interpersonal communication. And one example is, as you can see here, our school was really awesome in purchasing these really big whiteboards that we can use. And each student, we gave them at the beginning of the year their own whiteboard marker. So we've had students sort of either do like brainstorming activities in the target language, or they work in groups collaboratively to write or draw about a topic. So you can see this one is actually about characters in Don Quixote. And then they have some sort of a graphic organizer or a focus note taking that they go around the room and add to. Sometimes we have them present what they wrote on their whiteboards. And so I think these whiteboards can be a really good tool for interpersonal communication, even though it's a little bit less interpersonal than some activities. Also, we give students little whiteboards. Like we actually gave each student this year with that whiteboard marker a piece of paper and a plastic page protector. So in their binders, they just have a little whiteboard that's the size of a piece of paper. And then even though it's, again, less speaking interpersonally, they can answer questions on the fly by writing their answer on that whiteboard and hold it up. They could do that interpersonally with a partner, as a whole group interpersonally. And one other idea I've found to be more successful this year in the past, just because of our limited time, our limited movement in space and all that, is just call and response, which, going back to the Van Battenberg quote from the beginning of that sort of, are we giving them illusion of mastery? Call and response or pre-scripted tasks can be helpful and dangerous, I feel. So the call and response that I'm talking about in our novice language learners would be, we're learning how to ask what is your name in Spanish. So I say, okay, class, everyone say, good morning, so and so. And they repeat, good morning. And then we ask, what's your name? And then they all ask, what's your name, to that one person. And that person says, my name is Maddie. And then they say, hi, Maddie. So it's very scripted. It's very basic, but this was something we did on the first day of Spanish 1. So it's very novice level, and something that they were able to kind of interpersonally interact as a larger group. But the sort of script of that was all pre-done. And they didn't have to think very much. So, you have to take that with a grain of salt, balancing repetition and higher level thinking. So the hybrid model, we are in a hybrid model, and sometimes I have students on Zoom and in the room, or vice versa. So we have Zoom partners sometimes, where we'll have students in the room get on Zoom with students at home, and they talk to each other. And they can use the chat to do that. They can use their actual microphones and headsets like I'm wearing to do that. And because we have smaller groups of students in the rooms, that does work pretty well. Students at home really appreciate that because they get to interact with people in school. And then Google Slides is something that I have used a lot this year to have a lot of writing interpersonal communication. So I'll have students maybe make a slide on a topic, like they introduce themselves with a Google slide, and I give them directions. And then they comment on each other's slides. And that is the interpersonal piece. So they either ask a question or react to something. And then that is where the interpersonal piece comes in. Padlet is a similar tool you can use, not like Google Slides, but it's more of a website or an open canvas that you can set up various ways, like a back channel for interpersonal communication. You could set up discussion topics and have them respond below. You can have them link things and like each other's posts. The last thing that I wanted to bring up is just the most successful interpersonal communication piece that I've experienced with my novice language learners this year, and that is Flipgrid. In the past, for some reason, students in my high school classes have been really turned off to Flipgrid. They don't like using their video. They don't like being other people being able to see them and hear them. But this year, I really showed them the filters, and I think that they're getting the hang of it more because there's, for example, a filter where you can kind of blur out your video and your face, and you really can't see who the person is, but you can still hear them. And so I say that's fine if you don't want someone to see your video, but it's much better than having students like put their hand up and then talk. So they have really globbed onto this year, Flipgrid. And so I have an example of a task I gave them this year that's interpersonal. I chose them to choose two activities and ask their classmates what they like more. This was like a 2-second video that they recorded. So they said, ¿Qué te gusta más, bailar o cantar? And then they use their resources to say that in their video. Then they had to respond to at least 3 other videos with activities that they like to do more from those people's questions. And this, aside from any writing or listening activity that we did in class, got students to talk the most about the vocabulary we were using. And it got them to think the most about and really pay attention to what that person was saying. And these are students, some of them who just struggle to focus, struggle to do any work outside of school. This was the most engaging thing I found in distance learning this year. Another example of something similar to Flipgrid that we used was just in our Schoology learning management system. We gave students an assessment where we, as teachers, my colleague actually made a number of videos that we asked them questions, and then they, as an answer in the assessment, recorded their answer. So maybe the question was, "What do you like to do?" And then in their response, they say, I like to blah, blah, blah. And as a teacher, I actually really enjoy assessing their speaking like that because you get them in a space where they have a chance to think about the question, they think about their answer, and even it takes down on the translation piece because they have to say it. So they use the resources we give them a little bit more. So, anyways, these are some of the ideas I found to be successful with. It has been a challenge to get students to feel a little more comfortable using the language this year, but little by little, we're making progress, and I hope you are too. So, here are my references. And if you have any questions, I will add you will have my email with, I think, Attendify, and I will add it also to the very first slide in this presentation. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.